Welcome to Creepy Crime Cases. Today, we will be covering one of the most shocking cases about family betrayals that claimed the lives of 3 generations in a single day. I want to personally welcome you to today's episode. Thank you for your time. On December 24, 2007, Christmas Eve to be exact, in the quiet town of Carnation, Washington, a family prepared to celebrate. The scene was one of holiday tradition, but that tradition was about to be shattered by a violence so complete it would devastate the entire community. The perpetrators would not be strangers. They would come from within the family itself. Imagine a quiet little town called Carnation. It's not a big city place. It's one of those spots where everyone pretty much knows everyone else. It's about a half-hour drive from Seattle, Washington, but it feels a world away. There are lots of trees, open spaces, and a feeling of peace. This is where the Anderson family lived. Wayne and Judy Anderson were in their early 60s. By all accounts, they were good people, the kind of neighbors you'd be happy to have. They'd lived in Carnation for a long time and were well-liked. They had 2 grown children. Their son, Scott, was 32 years old. He was a carpenter, good with his hands, and he had built a wonderful life for himself. He was married to a woman named Erica, and together they had 2 beautiful little kids. Olivia was 5 years old, and her brother, Nathan, was just 3. They were a young and happy family, the pride of Wayne and Judy. The other child was their daughter, Michelle Anderson. She was 29 years old, and her life was on a very different path than her brother's. She wasn't really working steadily, and she seemed to struggle with finding her way. She lived with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, who was also 29. He did some work here and there as a clerk in a store, but it wasn't a steady thing. For quite a while, Michelle and Joseph had been living in a mobile home, a trailer, that was parked on her parents' property. This was a generous thing for Wayne and Judy to do. They let them live there without paying any rent. It was a way to help their daughter get on her feet. But as time went on, it seems this situation started to create some problems. Living rent-free can't last forever, and Wayne and Judy eventually decided it was time for Michelle and Joseph to start contributing. They weren't asking for a fortune, just some help with the rent for the space, and to chip in for utilities like electricity and water, and even for their car insurance. For most people, this would seem like a perfectly reasonable request. You're an adult, you should help out. But for Michelle Anderson, this request felt like a huge betrayal. It wasn't the only thing bothering her either. She had a long-standing grudge against her brother, Scott. She told people he had borrowed $40,000 from her years earlier and had never paid it back. We don't know if this was true or not, but in her mind, it was a solid fact. She was furious about it. And she was even more angry at her parents because she felt they were taking Scott's side in this money dispute. She felt they were supporting him and not her. This was the combination of things building up inside her, the anger over the supposed debt, and now the resentment about being asked to pay rent after all this time. She felt disrespected and stepped on. In the days leading up to Christmas in 2007, these feelings weren't getting better. They were getting worse. The holiday season, which is supposed to be about joy and family, was just highlighting all these tensions for her. The pressure was building, and she was talking to Joseph McEnroe about it. She was upset, she was angry, and she was starting to think about a very permanent solution to these problems she felt she couldn't escape. The Christmas Eve day in 2007 was cold and gray in Carnation on that faithful day, a pretty typical December day in the Pacific Northwest. For most families, the day is filled with a special kind of magic and anticipation. There's last-minute gift wrapping, the cooking of special meals, and the happy chaos of relatives arriving. At the Anderson family home, some of this was happening. Judy Anderson was in a back room of the house, carefully wrapping the last of the Christmas presents. The tree was decorated, the house was warm, and the stage was set for a family gathering later that afternoon. Her husband, Wayne, was elsewhere in the house, probably looking forward to seeing his son, Scott, his daughter-in-law Erica, and his two young grandchildren, Olivia and Nathan. It should have been a perfect, peaceful scene. But a short walk away, in the mobile home where Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe lived, a very different kind of plan was being set into motion. The ordinary sounds of a holiday were about to be drowned out by the darkest thoughts of two sinister individuals. Inside that trailer, Michelle's anger had reached a boiling point. All the old resentments, the $40,000 she believed her brother Scott owed her, the feeling that her parents had always taken his side, were colliding with the new, immediate pressure of being asked to pay rent and bills. She saw it as the ultimate betrayal. In her mind, her family wasn't just being unfair, they were actively pushing her down. She later told detectives that she was, quote, tired of everybody stepping on her. This wasn't just a passing mood. It was a deep, seething rage that had been festering for years, and it all came to a head on that specific day, December 24th. She had made a conscious decision. She decided that if her problems weren't resolved that day, she would end them herself. She stated her intent clearly later. Her plan was definitely to kill everybody. This was not a sudden, impulsive thought. It was a settled, grim resolution. She wasn't alone in this. Her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, was there with her. We don't know exactly what was said between them in that trailer, but whatever the conversation was, the outcome was clear. They both armed themselves with guns. They made the choice to turn their backs on everything, on family, on decency, on humanity itself, and become instruments of pure violence. The decision to pick up those weapons was the point of no return. Once they did that, the path forward led only to horror. They weren't going over to the main house to talk things out. They weren't going to have a difficult Christmas argument. The guns meant the conversation was over. The time for talking was done. The weapons in their hands were the only language they both decided to communicate with on that day. So they left the trailer. They walked across the property toward the main house where Michelle's parents were. Each step they took was a step further away from the world of normal people and into a nightmare of their own making. They reached the house, opened the door, and they walked inside. Wayne Anderson was there. He likely looked up, maybe expecting to see his daughter and her boyfriend coming to wish him a Merry Christmas. Instead, he was met with a cold reality of their intentions. The conversation, if you could even call it that, was likely short. Michelle's mind was already made up. She raised the gun she was carrying and she aimed it at her father. She pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot would have been enormous inside the house, a violent explosion of noise that shattered any last pretense of normalcy. But she missed. She fired at his head and the bullet did not find its mark. Her failure created an opening for Joseph McEnroe to step in. He wasn't just a bystander. He was a full participant. He saw Michelle miss, and he took over. Joseph McEnroe leveled his own gun. He didn't hesitate. While Wayne Anderson was likely reeling from the shock of the first shot, from the near miss, McEnroe took aim. He fired a single, precise shot. This time, the aim was true. The bullet struck Wayne Anderson in the head. It was a fatal wound. The kind, generous father was gone, killed in his own living room by his daughter's boyfriend on Christmas Eve. In a back room, Judy Anderson was wrapping Christmas gifts when she heard the shots. Two loud, unmistakable gunshots coming from her living room. Her mother's instinct would have taken over. She dropped what she was doing and she ran toward the sound. She ran into the living room. And she saw it. She saw her husband, Wayne, on the floor. She saw her daughter and Joseph McEnroe standing there with guns. She saw the reality of the nightmare. Her world collapsed in that instant. Joseph McEnroe turned his gun on her. He shot her. And then, in one of the most chilling details to come out of the entire case, the court documents say that he apologized to her. He said he was sorry. And then, after apologizing, he shot her again. This second shot was to her head. It was meant to finish the job. It was cold, it was calculated, and it was utterly heartless. An apology meant nothing when it was followed by another trigger pull. The first two victims were down and the Christmas Eve massacre was born. After the echoes of the gunshots faded in the living room, a strange and terrible quiet settled over the house. The immediate violence was over. Wayne and Judy Anderson were dead. But for Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe, the work was just beginning. This is where their actions become especially cold and hard to understand. They didn't panic. They didn't scream or cry or try to run away immediately. Instead, they switched into a mode of cold, practical calculation. They had just murdered two people in a brutal, messy way. And now they had to deal with the evidence. They needed to remove the obvious signs of what they had just done. The first task was the bodies. They had to move Wayne and Judy. The court documents state simply that they dragged the bodies to a shed behind the house. Their next task was the living room itself. Gunshots are messy. There would have been blood. So they set about cleaning it up. They looked for towels, carpets, and anything capable of soaking up liquids. They used these items to sop up the bloodstains, to try and erase the violence from the floor, to make the room look normal again. And when they were done cleaning up as best they could, they didn't leave. They didn't get in their car and run. They stayed and waited for Scott, Erica, 5-year-old Olivia, and 3-year-old Nathan to arrive for their Christmas Eve visit. They knew exactly who was coming and when. They sat in that living room, and they waited for the rest of Michelle's family to walk through the door. The waiting must have been tense, but they were committed. They had already crossed every line imaginable. Now they were just waiting to finish what they started. The calm they showed in this period is perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire story. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a planned execution, and they were the patient, cold-hearted executioners. Then, the sound came. Headlights swept through the windows, lighting up the room for a brief second. A car door slammed. Then another. Then the happy, chattering voices of a family arriving for a holiday visit. They walked up to the house, completely unaware. They expected to be greeted by Wayne and Judy. They expected warmth, laughter, the smell of Christmas dinner. They had no reason to expect anything else. They opened the door and they stepped inside. The scene that greeted them was wrong immediately. Their parents, Wayne and Judy, weren't there to welcome them. Instead, it was just Michelle and Joseph, standing in the living room. But Michelle and Joseph weren't there to talk. Michelle pulled out her gun and fired it. She shot him. The court papers say she shot him at least twice, and maybe as many as 4 times. The shots rang out, echoing the ones from earlier. Scott Anderson, fighting for his family, fell to the ground. At the same time, Erica Anderson was also shot. She was hit twice. But she was a mother, and her instincts were just as strong as Scott's. Wounded and bleeding, she didn't give up. She saw the cordless phone on an end table. She had crawled to the phone. For a single heart-stopping moment, she held the lifeline to the outside world in her hands. The 911 call that could have ended the horror was just a few button presses away. But Joseph McEnroe saw her and he moved fast. He wasn't going to let their plan fall apart now. He lunged for her and he tore the phone from her hands and he destroyed it. She looked up at Joseph McEnroe. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was pleading. She looked at him and she said, "You don't have to do this." Her words were a simple statement of truth. His response, as he later told detectives, was cold and absolute. He said, "Yes, we do." And then he raised the gun. He shot Erica Anderson in the head at point-blank range. He executed her in front of her children. What happened next is so awful that it is difficult to even think about. Joseph McEnroe turned his attention away from Erica's body and toward the children. He shot and killed 5-year-old Olivia Anderson. There are no words to describe the cruelty of this act. It is a level of evil that is almost impossible to comprehend. Then, McEnroe turned to the last person in the room. Nathan Anderson, who was only 3 years old. The court affidavit gives us a detail from McEnroe's own confession that is so haunting it has become a central part of this terrible story. In the chaos, the batteries had fallen out of the phone his mother had tried to use. Little Nathan, in his innocence, had picked them up. He was holding them in his small hand. McEnroe told the detectives that Nathan looked up at him. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just looked as if he understood. And then McEnroe did something else that is impossible to understand. He said he apologized to Nathan. He said he was sorry. And then, after apologizing, he raised his gun one final time and he shot and killed 3-year-old Nathan Anderson. After the final gunshot that killed 3-year-old Nathan faded away, a profound and terrible silence would have fallen over the Anderson house. The only sounds left were the ones Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe made themselves. The plan, in their minds, was complete. Now, they had to decide what to do next. The first instinct for most people who have committed a crime, any crime, is to run. To get as far away from the scene as possible. And that's what they decided to do. They left the house. They got into their car. They started driving. But they had no real plan. They weren't experienced criminals. They were in a state of shock, their minds probably reeling from the adrenaline and the horror of their own actions. At first, they pointed the car north. They drove toward Canada. The border was about 100 miles away. Maybe they thought they could disappear there, slip into another country and never be found. But as they drove, the reality of what they had done must have started to sink in. The plan was falling apart already. So, in a panic, they turned around. They decided to go south instead. They drove toward the state of Oregon. They had no money, no safe place to go, no friends who would hide them knowing what they had done. They were just driving aimlessly, putting miles between themselves and Carnation, but they were trapped in their own car, trapped with each other, and trapped with the memory of what they had done. After driving for hours, going first north and then south, they finally came to a staggering and foolish decision. They decided to turn around and go back. Their new plan, if one could even call it that, was to return to the house and pretend that they were the ones who had discovered the bodies. They thought they could act surprised. They thought they could walk in and call the police themselves and play the part of the shocked, grieving family members. It showed that they were not criminal masterminds. They were just desperate, confused, and in way over their heads. They drove all the way back to Carnation and arrived at the property on December 26th, 2 days after the murders. But when they got there, their plan immediately exploded. The property was swarming with police cars. Crime scene tape was everywhere. Officers were moving in and out of the house. The bodies had been discovered. They were too late. Their flawed escape had ended right back where it started, and now they were driving directly into the heart of the investigation. Detectives and forensic technicians were moving around with a serious, focused energy. The sheer scale of the tragedy, 6 people murdered, meant the investigation was massive from the very start. Michelle and Joseph got out of their car and entered this scene. They tried to act like they were just arriving and were shocked by what they found. But almost immediately, their behavior stood out to the experienced detectives on the scene. In the middle of all that chaos and grief, most people would be hysterical. They would be demanding answers. They would be asking, "What happened?" Michelle and Joseph didn't ask any of those questions. They didn't ask anything at all. They moved through the scene quietly. They didn't react like normal people would. This cold, calm behavior was a huge red flag for the investigators. The questioning began. At first, they probably tried to stick to their plan, to act confused and innocent. But their stories were weak. They had no good explanation for where they had been for the last 2 days. The detectives, armed with the evidence already gathered at the house and the glaring oddity of their behavior, kept pressing. They were skilled interviewers, and they were dealing with 2 amateurs who were exhausted, scared, and crumbling under the weight of their own guilt. One of them broke first. The other had no reason to stay silent. They each provided lengthy, detailed confessions. They described everything. The legal process that followed was long, but the outcome was certain. Joseph McEnroe was tried first. Almost a year later, Michelle Anderson stood trial. The prosecution called 38 witnesses, but the most powerful evidence was their own words, the detailed confessions. Michelle's defense team didn't even call any witnesses. There was nothing to argue. The jury found her guilty on all 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Since Washington state does not have the death penalty, the sentence was automatic: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joseph McEnroe received the same sentence, 6 life terms. There was no celebration in the courtroom when the verdict was read. There was only relief for the families of the victims and a sense of grim finality. The justice system had done its job, but it couldn't bring back Olivia, Nathan, Erica, Scott, Judy, or Wayne. The confessions had closed the case, and the life sentences had closed the door on the 2 killers, but for the family and the community of Carnation, the pain of that Christmas Eve would remain forever. A crime of this magnitude doesn't just vanish after the trial. It sinks into the soil of the place where it happened. It becomes a permanent part of the community's history, a dark shadow that forever changes how people see their own home. For the residents of Carnation, the idyllic idea of a safe, quiet town where everyone knows everyone was shattered on Christmas Eve in 2007. After that, trust had to be rebuilt. For Pam Mantle, Erica's mother, hearing the word guilty was a necessary relief, but it wasn't a cure. She and the other grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and friends of the Anderson family have to find a way to carry this grief with them for the rest of their lives. They have to find a way to remember the Anderson family for how they lived, not just how they died. Meanwhile, Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe remain in the Washington state prison system. They will never be released. They will live out their days in a cell, with only their memories and each other's testimony for company. They have plenty of time to think about their actions on that December day. One can only wonder if they feel any remorse, or if they are still trapped in the same twisted logic that led them to believe murder was a solution to their problems. Their existence now is a form of living death, a permanent removal from society for crimes a court determined were so heinous they forfeited their right to ever walk free again. The story of the Carnation murders is often told as a true crime case, a tale of unbelievable evil and of a family destroyed. But at its heart, it's a warning. It's a stark reminder of how unchecked resentment and entitlement can fester into something monstrous. It reminds us to pay attention to the people in our lives who seem consumed by grievance, to seek help for them and for ourselves before problems feel insurmountable. The story echoes in Carnation not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson in the absolute, vital importance of communication, compassion, and mental health awareness, and the devastating cost that can come when all of those things break down at once. The community's quiet strength in the years since the tragedy is a testament to the fact that while darkness can visit anywhere, it does not get to define the people who live there. We have come to the end of today's episode. I thank you all for being here. Do well to drop a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to more true crime contents like this. Goodbye and stay safe.